Slow motion is awesome. Remember when the movie 300 came out and you saw those like... Man, looks so good. Hey, it's John Bear. So happy to see your beautiful face, and today I'm gonna talk about when to use slow motion, why to use slow motion, and some considerations before using slow motion. I'm gonna treat this video as a complete introduction to slow motion in general. Whether you're a beginner or an intermediate, I'm sure you will find this video, this comprehensive introduction, useful. All right, let's go. Welcome back. If you're new here, I'm John Bear, and I make videos about how to make videos and Micro Four Thirds cameras. So if you're into that, then hit that subscribe button. Alright, first off, why shoot slow motion? Because it's awesome! There are a few reasons to shoot slow motion. Some technical reasons and some artistic reasons. Technical reasons to use slow motion is when you're shooting something handheld, and maybe your camera does not have any stabilization, so your footage is gonna come out looking a little bit shaky. If you film in slow motion, however, then you will iron out that shakiness. So especially if you're using a camera that does not have stabilization, using slow motion can be a very nice way to get those smooth shots even when you're running around handheld, run and gun style. The artistic reasons to shoot slow motion is when you wanna drag out some feeling. Either you wanna emphasize something or you wanna make something feel more dreamlike. Which brings me to when to shoot slow motion. So generally when I think about slow motion, I always think about 3 different ways of shooting. The 3 different ways of shooting is 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and 120 frames per second. I think these 3 cover most of your needs. 24 frames per second is not slow motion. This is the real time. This is the frame rate that you will conform everything else to. So 24 frames per second is when you want to drag your audience into the world. You want to make them feel like a part of it. This is real life. This is raw and rough real life. Personally, I love 24 frames per second, and you're watching me right now in 24 frames per second. This is the frame rate that just feels like cinema. Usually news broadcasts will be like 30 or even like 50 frames per second, which to me feels too smooth. 24 is just perfect. You got that nice motion blur. 24. Raw. Love it. Then there's the 60 frames per second slow motion. Now this is the nice middle ground. This is the dreamy slow motion. This is what you can use to slow down slight movements. I like 60 frames per second a lot as well. 60 frames per second for me is the dream slow motion. This is what I use when I want to make something feel otherworldly or more happy than it really is. This is why you see me using 60 frames per second a lot in my travel films. It just looks nice. For me, watching my own travel films in 60 frames per second, it just feels like I'm being transported back to a dream. It's awesome. 60 frames works great with slight movement, not too fast movements. For example, you're filming somebody cooking food or doing slight movements with their hands. Next, we've got 120 frames per second slow motion. Wow. Now, this is the one that I consider the 300 slow-mo. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the movie 300 uses slow motion to really emphasize impacts. Like just the moment he cuts the dude, it just slows down to like this super slow motion. Although now that I think about it, calling 120 frames per second the 300 slow-mo is a little confusing, but I hope you get what I mean. 120 frames per second slow motion is great for like fast actions. Or when you're filming like the elements, like water. 120 also looks awesome when you film fire. I recently used 120 frames per second slow motion when I was filming a tea commercial where this wooden spoon is letting the tea leaves fall down very gently. So 120 frames per second is for the high velocity action, or when you're filming elements like water, fire, or like dust. 120 frames per second slow motion is also really good when you're filming that handheld B-roll. Let's say you want to get those smooth sliding shots while filming some environment or something. No matter what, when you're filming 120, everything looks smooth. Alright, so I've covered why to use slow motion and when, which situation to use which slow motion in. Now let's talk a little bit about the considerations before using slow motion. The first consideration is shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically how often the shutter opens and closes when you're filming. So generally, there's a rule called the 180-degree rule. When you follow this rule, you want your shutter to be twice of your frame rate. So if you're filming 24 frames per second, make that shutter around 50. If you're filming 60 frames per second, make that shutter 120. If you're filming 120 frames per second, make that shutter 240 or 250, depending on what your camera will allow you to do. Maintaining this rule to keep the shutter speed twice of what you're filming is important to get that nice motion blur. I have some other videos about that you can check out when I'm talking about the ND filters. But safe to say, you want to always follow this rule. Which brings me to the next consideration, which is some people like to film everything in 60 frames per second and then only slow it down to 24 frames when they need to. But the problem with this is when you take a 60 frames per second clip and you cram that into a 24 frames per second timeline and try to play it back in real time, you will lose all of that motion blur, because basically it's like filming in 24 frames per second, but you have shutter speed that's way too fast. So you get this sort of choppy movement because without motion blur, it just feels unnatural. So I really want to emphasize that you shoot in the correct frame rate for the correct scene. Don't be lazy and try to film everything in 60 frames per second and then slow it down if you want to, or keep it normal speed when you want to. Instead, it's much better to be deliberate with it and shoot correctly in the first place. Don't try to fix it in post. However, if you do happen to shoot 60 and you want to use it in real time and you want that motion blur, well, there's something you can do. You can open up After Effects and you can use an effect called Pixel Motion Blur. Apply that to your clip and you get some fake motion blur. I might have used it on occasion. I also use it for my drone clips. But that's a lot of effort, and unless you have a fast editing computer, it's gonna be quite the hassle. So to summarize, shutter speed, always keep it twice your frame rate. Moving on to the next consideration, which is lighting. Now, one thing about shutter speed is that it will affect your exposure. So having faster shutter speeds will make it so that your lens is getting less light every second, which will darken your image, give you less exposure. So essentially, when you're filming in 24 frames per second, you need less light, so it's easier to film in low light. However, once you start filming in 60 frames per second, you need more light. If you go all the way to 120 frames per second, you need a lot of light. So I would never use it unless in like broad daylight. And you can see me actually break this rule when I'm filming the water in the bathroom right there. And here you can see another problem that rears its head. When you're using practical, normal household lights, the lights will flicker at a rate that it will become visible in the video if your shutter speed does not match the flickering of your lights. You see those little wow, 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 wow. If you have a smartphone that can shoot slow motion, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you're gonna film in 120 frames per second slow motion, make sure that you're shooting in daylight or you have really good lights. You've seen the slow-mo guys on YouTube, right? They always film in their backyard on a sunny day. Always. No matter how crazy their experiments are, they always film in broad daylight. And that's because they're shooting with cameras that have like thousands of frames per second. So if I'm telling you that 120 frames per second is already too cumbersome for some lighting situations, can you imagine what those guys have to deal with? I bet even if they have like a single cloud in the sky, they're like, too bad, can't film today. Next consideration for slow motion is the resolution and bitrate that your camera offers. Generally, the higher you go with your frame rate to get more slow motion, the more limited your camera is in recording options. If you're all of a sudden gonna go to 120 frames per second, usually you can't film that in 4K unless you have the newest cameras. And even if you can film 120 frames per second slow motion in 4K, you won't get the same color bitrate. What this means is that there's a trade-off between quality and frames per second. So the slower your footage, the less quality you're gonna get. Meanwhile, if you film in 24 frames per second, which is the real-time, rough reality, you can always have the best resolution and colors that your camera offers. Which is another reason why you should not film in 60 frames per second all the time. So for example, with this camera, the Panasonic GH5, when I film in 120 frames per second slow motion, I can only do it in 1080p, which means I upscale it to 4K to match the other footage. Now, you're watching this on your mobile device or your computer, you're not gonna notice. Now we're getting to the end of the video and I hope you're still invested in this. I have one last consideration that I want to talk about in regards to slow motion, and that is how slow motion affects the energy in your video. And I know that sounds like woo-woo, like whoa, it affects the energy, oh. What I mean is, if you have a video where every single shot is slow motion, it just sort of drags the whole video to a snail's pace. When I talk about energy in editing, there are 3 things that affects the energy of your video. The first is the frame rate. The second is how fast you're cutting. And the last one is the action that's going on the screen. So let's say I'm gonna give a scene like full energy rating, like 10 out of 10 energy. That would be like a kung fu fight scene with fast cuts and 24 frames per second, real raw, real time. But let's say I still have the kung fu fight scene, I have the fast editing, but everything is slow motion. All of a sudden that fight scene becomes a 6 out of 10 maybe, because all the shots are slow motion. See what I'm getting at? So going by the same standard, if you're looking at a travel film like the one I did in Turkey, Cappadocia, the energy for that, I would say, is like a mellow 4 or even 5, because I'm editing it quite fast and some of the scenes can be quite cool, but in general, I use so much slow motion that it has a bit of a dreamy, mellow pace, which is fine because that was what I was going for. So just try to keep this energy scale in mind, like when you're editing the video, what type of energy do you want to deliver? Do you want like raw energy? Then don't film in slow motion at all. Or use it sparingly like 300 does. And the movie 300 is actually a really good example of how to use slow motion. It uses it to emphasize like key moments or emphasize cool actions. So yeah, this final point has been a bit of a personal opinion, but I think this energy scale makes sense. And if you're going for more high energy, then don't shoot slow motion. All right, that's the end of this video. I hope you found this introduction and comprehensive overview of slow motion helpful. With all these considerations in mind, I'm sure you will have realized that slow motion is not the best thing in the world. It can sometimes be a hurdle. It can cause you technical difficulties. It can degrade the quality of your footage, and it can lower the energy of your footage. So balance it well, use it wisely. With great power comes great responsibility, like the great Uncle Ben used to say. What a guy. Thank you so much for watching. Leave me a subscribe or even hit that bell, because that's a virtual high five, because I make videos about how to make professional video and how to handle your camera. And if that's what you're into, then hitting that subscribe button is a no-brainer. I also live in Iceland, so you'll see some occasional vlogs from me now and then in Iceland. Cool, huh? Again, I'm John Bear, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.